1st of February, 4th Sunday of Epiphany. Sermon on John chapter 2 verses 1 to 11 and Psalm 36 verses 5 to 10. In John's Gospel, the miracles of Jesus are referred to as signs, giving them an immediately deeper significance. They tend to be linked to a passage of teaching or to evoke comparisons with God the Father, and are placed in the Gospel accounts to emphasize Jesus' divine qualities. John wrote his Gospel with the aim of revealing Jesus as the Christ, the Son of God, so that by believing we might have life in his name. The miracle of changing water into wine at a wedding in Cana slightly breaks the mould in that Jesus had not yet officially begun his ministry, and a social event, one at which his mother appears to have had some role of supervision, lacks the gravitas of the later occasions when Jesus performed signs. Weddings in first century Israel generally lasted a week, and the fact that the guests had already drunk all the wine provided indicates a fairly convivial atmosphere, to say the least. However, to run out of a commodity such as wine was seen in that society as a serious breach of hospitality. According to Bruce Milne, such an occurrence had, on occasion, led to lawsuits. At the very least, it was a slur on the reputation of the bridegroom, and Mary clearly felt that action needed to be taken urgently. She told Jesus. She evidently believed that he could resolve the situation, though it might strike us as strange that she would thrust the role of vintner upon her son. Jesus himself appeared to be somewhat nonplussed by her request, and his reply, "Woman, what does this have to do with us? My hour has not yet come," sounds brusque to the point of rudeness to our ears. We must assume that addressing his mother as woman was more appropriate than it would be today. But his apparent denial of any responsibility towards the situation sounds exactly right. What indeed did the wine supply at a wedding at which he was a guest have to do with him? Strangely, although he seems to have refused responsibility, Mary simply ignored that fact and told the servants, "Do whatever he tells you," at which Jesus instructed the men to fill 6 big stone jars with water. These were promptly filled, and then Jesus said to draw some off and give it to the steward. The steward tasted what he was given and declared it was the best wine ever. In concluding his account of this event, John wrote in his Gospel, "This was the first of Jesus' signs, and revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him." When I was a little girl, I watched a magician turn a glass tumbler full of confetti into a glass of orange squash and give it to someone to drink. It was a very clever trick. But why did Jesus apparently seek to reveal his glory and impress his disciples with what looks like a party trick, such as any fake magician might perform? Why also did he provide about 180 gallons of wine to a group of people who were already fairly tanked up? In his commentary on John, Bruce Milne rather hysterically insists that this miracle must not be taken to encourage the drinking of alcohol by Christians. Surely, whatever individuals believe about the consumption of alcoholic drinks, no one would consider 180 gallons of wine as reasonable, even for a large gathering. It sounds like several years' supply. So what are we to make of this miraculous sign? During his ministry, Jesus often set precedents. But this was an occasion when he followed precedent. Lavish provision of the necessities of life by God had occurred on numerous occasions in the course of Israelite history. At the very beginning, the Lord had provisioned Eden with all that could possibly be needed to sustain life abundantly. As the Israelites travelled through the wilderness on their way to the Promised Land, God provided water, quails and manna, which literally dropped from heaven. In our Old Testament reading today, we hear of God empowering Elijah miraculously to provide flour and oil for a widow throughout a period of severe famine. One of God's roles is to sustain the life he has created, and in this profligate supply of wine for a wedding, Jesus was demonstrating his power to create and provide divine acts of love and mercy. He was following in his Father's footsteps. In fairy stories, magic is employed to do very unlikely things, to turn pumpkins into coaches, frogs into princes, pebbles into jewels, and other unlikely and unnatural transformations. In turning water into wine, however, Jesus was doing no such thing. This was, in spite of appearances, no cheap magician's trick. He was simply speeding up a natural process. Vines draw up water from the earth. The water helps to produce leaves, flowers, and to swell the fruit, grapes. The grapes can then be crushed, and the sugars within and the yeast naturally present on the grape skins cause the grape juice to ferment into wine. Wine, like all God's gifts, is intended to be used sensibly and shared so that everyone has enough but not in excess. We must hope that the wedding guests at Cana drank responsibly and kept the surplus for other occasions. God's love and provision for his creatures is well expressed in Psalm 36, part of which is one of our lectionary readings for today. I first saw our opening verse on a billboard outside a church when I was not a Christian, but it impressed me even then. Your love, O Lord, reaches to the heavens, your faithfulness to the skies. That speaks of limitless, immeasurable love. God's righteousness is compared to mighty mountains, his justice to the great deep sea. The Lord is concerned to preserve both humans and animals, and all, regardless of status, can find refuge in the shadow of his wings. But it's the next verses that are most relevant to our Gospel reading. We may feast in the abundance of God's house and drink from his river of delights. Furthermore, the Lord is described as the fountain of life, whose light illuminates us. Perhaps it was these verses that Jesus had in mind when he relented and followed his mother's suggestion to instruct the servants at the wedding, producing an abundance, and provided an example of the Lord's river of delights. He certainly prevented the wedding from being a failure and a scandal, rather than the joyous occasion that the bride and bridegroom had intended. Jesus was not a meek and mild killjoy, as he's often presented. Rather, he appears as a robust, authoritative person, good company, yet mindful of the vulnerabilities of others, and full of compassion. The fact that he drew people to him, had people hanging on his words, loving and trusting him, is evidence enough. This first public appearance of Jesus at Cana, attending a wedding, is a good enough introduction to him as our loving and powerful Saviour. God on earth, ministering to the needs of ordinary people and producing an abundance of excellent wine. It's a good first image for us to hold in our minds as we progress towards Lent, when we remember the ultimate provision that our God made for us on the cross.